So I keep on telling you that after certainly the next general election, of course, there is a big opportunity for us as progressives to do a lot of stuff against a very much diminished Conservative Party who will be arguing against themselves, caught in a civil war for potentially the next decade. So they would not be able to pull themselves out of this until at least after maybe like 2033. And think during that time, just think during that time, how much stuff we could get done with them diminished, with them out of power, being able to agree, being able to be an effective opposition because they're just so obsessed with infighting each other. The possibilities, as I've said before, are infinite and such a good possibility to be able to do. And that's why I really want to focus, because this is the first time I've really seen someone write about this. This is from, hang on, let me get her. So Gabby Hinsliff. So she's a columnist for the Guardian or the Observer. I can't remember which one, maybe both. But she's written about this, about looking at what the Tories are doing and the prospect and the possibility of what could happen once they lose. So we're just going to go through a couple of bits of this because I think it's well worth highlighting some of the points that she brings up, because some of these points I have been bringing up time and time again to tell you why they are so important and why we need to really focus on doing this. Because the possibilities for passing a lot of progressive policy with having little to no effective Conservative opposition is going to be big. So the possibilities are big, the opportunities are amazing, but of course, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to absolutely smash the Tories in 2024. So before we do, just getting on into some of these bits that I want to cover that she brought up in her column on this. Like I say, please do remember to click the like, share, and subscribe button. Like I say, down below, there's the Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, and all the other stuff down below as well. So let's go diving on into this, because I really do think this is important to cover. So this is in the Guardian Online today with the title of "Forget About 2024. The brightest Tory stars are vying to rebuild the party in the wake of defeat." And I agree. I really do agree. So I just want to start off highlighting this, because I just want to really, because it sets the picture of where the Tory party really is. So there comes a time in the life of government where it dawns on everyone that the ship is going under. And so there begins the scramble for the lifeboats. A trickle of MPs wanting to stand down at the next election swells to a flood, all hoping to beat the post-election rush for jobs on the outside. Others have been pleading for airlifted to safety in the House of the Lords. Yet, even as the rats start fleeing the proverbial, it often pays to watch the hardier souls swimming inexplicably towards it. And the two people that I do agree are the ones to watch are Rupert Harrison and Nick Timothy. Both these people in the past have been very influential to the Conservative Party as advisors. Obviously, Rupert Harrison, he's George Osborne's former right-hand man, described as the real power behind the throne. Like he was cast as, it's not George Osborne who's the real chancellor, it's him. You know, George Osborne is the puppet. You know, he's the real power behind the throne. And then, of course, you've got Nick Timothy, Theresa May's, you know, former minister. He wielded quite a lot of power. So those two people are ones to watch because in a very, very diminished Tory party, in a party that will have very few precious MPs, those with the loudest voices will, tend to steer direction. And of course, they are going to be fighting against each other like cats in like like rats in the sack. As we said, the more the bigger a defeat we deliver them, the more this lasts, the more this infighting lasts in the party. And that is really good to highlight. But of course, who else might be competing in this competition? That's very good to ask as well, because they are not the only ones who are doing this. And also, I want to point out that, bear in mind, if you know your party is in such a state, if your party is in such a state and you were Rishi Sunak, instead of maybe going on holiday, you would probably instead maybe spend the summer talking to your MPs, trying to find maybe some form of unity or coming up with some plans or something. You would at least do something. But as I've said before, and I will make the case again, Rishi Sunak is a do nothing prime minister. Even during this point, he has done nothing. Instead, as soon as Parliament ended, he has dived over across the pond over to California. Like, he is on holiday for quite a long time. In fact, according to reports, most of the summer he's going to be spending outside of the UK. So if he had any sense, if he had any real sense about him, he would be instead spending this summer rallying his MPs, getting some sort of coherent, um, government together, and making sure that they could do something. But of course, they're not. And that's why you constantly see this discussion, certainly amongst many Tories, that they're going to lose, that they've lost, they're resigning themselves to a loss, and it's just a matter of, well, how big is this loss going to be? And as I've said, we've got to ensure that it is a big loss. As I said, not the only potential people we should be worried about, because there are those others. So who's going to be picking up the pieces of this Tory party afterwards? You've just had those two, which again, going to be potentially, if they do win, quite influential. So there's Kimmy Badenoch we talked about before, although her chances, as we've said, because of her recent actions regarding Brexit, there were a lot of Brexiteers who laid out and said, no, you can never, ever be prime minister. We will just not let you. So Kimmy Badenoch's chances, but given the fact that most of the Brexiteers, and we've seen the hardcore Brexiteers, are going to lose their seat, well, she might be in with a chance again. So Kimmy Badenoch is a potential reasonable person. Well, no, I say potential reasonable person, but I say potential likely candidate who could end up taking leadership. But again, she's not alone, because there will be a hardcore who will push back against her, like Suella Braverman. Definitely a contender. Remember, she went out on the National Conservative platform and basically said, I am the party's next leader. She's going to be there. And then, of course, there's Penny Mordaunt. And we've talked about Penny Mordaunt before, being potentially one of the front runners, but her own seat isn't guaranteed. Portsmouth North is not a guaranteed seat for her, so she may not even be there as an MP. James Cleverly, who knows what he'll end up doing, but as people have described him before, no one's really sure what he stands for. And I agree with that. I agree with that statement. No one really knows what he stands for. Gillian Keegan, again, someone else who could be a good, person to position themselves as a potential Tory candidate. She has her story of how she worked her way up from a factory apprentice to, a successful businesswoman. And that is the kind of story that the Tories like, that, oh, someone who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and, got into a position of power will make her prime minister. It's potential. There are, again, as we've said, there are the potential people right there to pick up the pieces. But it's, what do you do? What happens? So we'll just pick up from here. So, but whoever the candidate, their first task will be winning the coming argument about why the Tories lost. And that's the big question. Lots of parties fail to do after losses for quite some time, as you were about to see here. So, not everyone is convinced that they will, especially on the Labour side, which still bears the scars of being disappointed once too often. But let's assume for now that the polls and by-election results are signs of panic in a government party that are all reliable weather vanes. The bitter recriminations that would follow a thumping defeat and the new Conservative intake of 2024 would be a small but potentially influential voice, untainted by the mistakes of office and bristling with frustration at the mess that their predecessors have made of things. So that is something worth to remember. As we said, there would be this constant fighting in between them of new potential Tory MPs that weren't there in the last parliament. All that Tory mess. Well, it's not my fault. I was an MP back then. I'm blaming it on trusts, etc. So there's going to be a lot of Tory recrimination going on. But as we said before, Truss ain't going away. Truss, even if she loses or even retains her seat, I think she will become somewhat of a very large voice outside of the Conservative Party, trying to push it forward towards these crazy neoliberal principles that she now openly advocates for. But this is where it gets interesting. So the post-mortem won't simply pit the right against the left or Leave against Remain. An inevitable backlash against not having built enough houses or even offered enough in general to anyone under 45 could unite liberal young Tories stuck in the rented London flats and hardcore right-wingers shouting with some justification that Liz Truss was right about confronting the NIMBYs. Remember, they're not in my backyard, people. That's what NIMBY stands for. So this could be something that maybe unites them, but it's going to be a very costly clash. They're going to be fighting against each other. They are going to be really up against each other. And it comes, as I will get into this bit in the article now, the clash is between the two approaches that often follow defeats, which is either you change tack or you double down. So the first camp will argue that, it says here, the Tories lost because they came across as economically reckless, failing to understand or even care about the damage done to Middle England, and too shrill by half on social issues. They'll be itching to say things the grassroots party still doesn't want to hear about the damage done by a hard Brexit, both to the economy and the loyalists of Remain voting Tories in places such as North Oxfordshire, where Harrison is fighting the newly created Bicester and Woodstock seat, on the edge of David Cameron's old patch. The bold will argue that it is time for more constructive relationships with Europe, but what they will really want to do is put all that embarrassment behind them and try to get back to running everything like they used to. Harrison, whose selection in his old bosses Osborne is described as a sign that the seeds of renewal have already been planted and could become a rallying point for those nostalgic for the stability of the old Cameron era. So that is a possibility of what could happen. We have seen this, that there are sections of the Tory party that feel really embarrassed about Brexit, that knew that Brexit was a mistake, but they went along with it anyway, being very, very much pushed along by the hardcore Brexiteers, and they've ended up in a very bad economic situation, one of which The Tories, as we always said, pride themselves on being the party of competent economic management. But if anything, they have been anything but that party for quite some time. Bear in mind, if you really look at, want to look at the numbers of conservative versus sort of Labour governments, but especially in recent times, especially under Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, doesn't really prove those credentials. They've sort of lost that. But you could definitely see, and I do agree, this argument that we need to go back to the Cameron years could become a new favourite, getting back to some form of sensible nostalgia in a way. That is likely. That is very, very likely. And I think you could see that. But of course, this will be the other competing argument, the double down argument, that they just weren't simply going far enough. This is where you see the revolutionaries really push hard, and you could see this a lot. So the double down contingent, however, are nowhere near ready to let go of their revolution. They will argue that, like communism, the true Brexit has never really been tried, and none could be made to work. That Boris Johnson's deal was a bad one, that punches were pulled on immigration, and that Britain could still somehow be booming outside the EU, given the kind of activist industrial strategy and radical reforms that Timothy, who is standing in Matt Hancock's Old West Stafford seat, favoured. They do not want to admit that Brexit has bombed out, but it will also argue that it is no longer possible to just go back to how things were. The political and economic realignments of the past 7 years aren't so simply reversed. The ensuing battle threatens to be bloody, exhausting, and bitter, and perhaps even to the point of risking splits and breakaway factions. The longer it drags on, the better for Labour. That is the point I am saying. Just imagine for a second, is what we've been saying in this, and now of what I've been telling you all the time, that you've got these two potential competing factions after a very much devastating Tory loss. You've got one side that yearns to go back to this David Cameron uh, style era of politics, this sort of Tory nostalgia. Oh, weren't things good under David Cameron? Let's pursue those policies again. Meanwhile, as was said there, you've got the revolutionaries that their Brexit was never really tried, that the opportunities were just not seized, that we really haven't had true Brexit, that it will not be ready to give up on that. And that in reality, they need to go further and harder, doubling down on a lot of Liz Truss's policies and go even further. And we're talking full on free market fundamentalism. And that and Cameronism, they do not match. They will not gel. And it will be a monumental fight. But that is what we want. That is what we want, because that will be an absolute gift to the Labour Party, because they could spend, as we said, the next decade arguing about that internally in the party. So they're not an effective opposition because they're too busy fighting each other on their own benches in Parliament with breakaway factions and factions within factions, as we've seen even now, fighting against each other. This could become such an amazing opportunity for progressive policies being put forward and pushed by a big majority of progressives in Parliament. This is what I've constantly been talking to you about why we need to really focus on beating them in 2024. And regardless of your thoughts of Keir Starmer or whatever, the opportunities far, far, far outweigh any arguments you have against Keir Starmer or whatever. Because the opportunities that are being put forward before us right now are so big so huge, we could really fundamentally change the country. I'm talking we could get PR, that we could change the Westminster voting system, that properly reforming the House of Lords into a second elected body will not be a fantasy, but it will be a genuine reality that can be put forward and voted on in that parliament. There are opportunities we simply must seize. And the danger comes, because they also talk about in this article as well, that if they manage to hang on, that Starmer instead gets maybe a small minority or even a hung parliament, because maybe they just managed to hang on, and that they sense that his government could fall to pieces. And that if it falls to pieces, well, then there's chances for them to retake and reclaim power. And remember, even then, those two factions will be very much fighting against each other, even in that potential general election. One of which, should they win, could prove even more damaging. And you are seeing right now the damage that the Tory Party has really been done to this country since Brexit. And that's the reality of the situation that we are faced with. That is generally the reality of the situation we are faced with. In 2024, you must put aside all your feelings about anything else and beat the Tories. So that means if you have to vote Labour in tactical voting, you have to vote Labour. If you have to vote Lib Dem, well, then vote Lib Dem. Because that is the opportunity. That is the chances we have. The bigger defeat we deliver to the Tories in 2024, the more the party is smashed to pieces, and it can spend the next decade arguing amongst itself, unable to really put forward any actual opposition to any progressive policies that we can put forward. And that's the true opportunity that presents itself in 2024. And that is the thing I keep on talking about. The opportunity is there. We have to really seize it. But I'll be talking about this, as I have done for quite a while now, about the opportunities for 2024. So the chances are this won't be the last time we don't talk. We will or won't talk about this. But yeah, as always, thank you very much as always for following and watching today. And we'll we'll see you all next time. But please do remember to click on the like and share button on your way out. And of course, we'll see you very soon.